Good afternoon and welcome to our next lecture in our series of lectures from GEO. This afternoon we are speaking to Gill Miller. She is a Senior Lecturer Emerita at the University of Chester, specialising in international development. She's also held a variety of posts around the A-level syllabus and education, including being the Chief Examiner of A-levels. And she's also been president at the GA for the last year and is also a current trustee of the FSC. Now, today, Gill is going to be presenting to us Trading with the Dragon, China in Africa. And as usual, we will save questions for the end, but feel free to put any questions you have in the chat box to the right, and we'll get to those at the end of the session. Okay, well, when you're ready, Gill, over to you.
Thanks very much, Isabel. That's great. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for engaging with GEO. I'm sure that some of you are specifically studying China, and others of you will be exploring international trade or geopolitics, and some of you will have looked at globalization, and in that case, you'll be looking at evolving connections and interdependence between places. So I hope this lecture will be of use to you. It's going to cover a lot of ground, and it will take you further than the textbooks. And there are some maps and diagrams which I'll refer to as we go through, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time on those because that's for you after the lecture. You can revisit it, and perhaps it will whet your appetite for some discussion. There is a list of reading and viewing, because there's a video I've recommended at the end of this lecture, so you can pick that up. Last week there was some interaction between Professor Harwood and your good selves, but this time I'm just going to go straight through, if I may, and you can put questions in the chat box and we can have some time at the end. So I hope that's going to work for you all. So in the lecture, we're going to have a look at the perspectives of China from at the very beginning. We look at trade and investments, and you can't really understand China and trade without looking at some of the cultural and social issues, and Chinese diplomacy is a really big part of all this. And then we'll conclude with some thoughts about the view from Africa. But during the course of the lecture, I've got two questions for you. What do you think? Do you think China is a benevolence in Africa? Or do you think that Africa and African nations and Africans should beware of China? It is not straightforward, and we'll perhaps, during the course of the lecture, perhaps you'll be able to develop a view. Okay? So sometimes, or I suppose over the last 15 years or so, China has been making the headlines. And often they've been negative ones, and often it's been the West worried about being frozen out from Africa. And so you can see some of these headlines here. Top right, China strikes a £1 billion deal to increase trade with Africa, and the Western nations are not really helping out, and their aid is decreasing, and we're worried about Chinese influence. There's a one there about cheap goods and new jobs, that Chinese manufacturers will just destroy the African market for goods and take away their jobs. Know very well that Africa has lots of resources and miners, particularly the big Western and global transnationals, really concerned about the opportunities to go and exploit and remove minerals from Africa, because China is going to exclude them. And then it's the big money as well. You've got a headline there from the Ghanaian Times, $2 billion from China just in Ghana for finance and infrastructure. And that's really quite recent. And finally, where is China in terms of the unstable and fragile states? It's 2/3 of African countries are now using Chinese military equipment. And from the Western perspective, that's scary, because unstable and fragile states can tip over the edge if they've got arms which are freely available. Just another one too. China has got a large population, and it absorbs very large proportion of global resources. So you can see 40% of pork goes to China, 59% of cement, gold, nickel, coal, a lot of the global minerals are going to support China's economy. And the West is scared of how much is not going to be left for them. China is increasingly in control of the media in Africa, whether it's social media or whether it's television or radio. And then something which perhaps you're not aware of is China's diplomatic clout and muscle, if you like. So on the right-hand side, I put there an extract from The Guardian and then the Business Insider. Now, there's the headline. China's booming trade with Africa helps its diplomatic muscle. It's far from resource-rich, but Malawi is reaping the economic rewards of aid from Beijing after dumping its allegiance to Taiwan. Now, the story there is that until 1949 in China, really severe and debilitating civil war between the communists and the existing Chinese government. The communists won. The previous government left China in 1949, defeated, and set up a Republic of China in Taiwan. And the People's Republic of China, which now exists, is absolutely adamant that Taiwan belongs to the People's Republic. But the government in Taiwan is desperately trying to maintain its independence and would like to join the United Nations. And People's Republic are doing everything they can to not let that happen. So one of the issues, or the thoughts, perspectives, is that the People's Republic are trying to influence the African states to vote against Taiwan joining the United Nations. So that's the background to those two. Business Insider, after a $40 million pledge from China, Nigeria tells Taiwan's capital office to pack its bags. The People's Republic of China does not like the independence of Taiwan. So what are the possible relationships with China? How could we kind of classify these? Well, people could think of China as a partner, strategic commitment, very cooperative, long-term commitment, good news. Or is China thought of as a competitor? It's a competitor to the rest of the world. It's grabbing the resources. And critically, is China taking resources which African firms could actually use themselves for their own industries? So in that sense, it's a competitor of Africa's own resources. And is China a colonizer? There was Western colonization, of course. We've heard a lot about that in recent months. But now that's been displaced, is China replacing that as a neo-colonial influence with partnerships with the elite, the ruling government and the wealthy people in African states? So it's not, people aren't quite sure where you would classify China's relationship. But here's three quotes which take you in some direction. First of all, the Nigerian president in 2006 said, 21st century is the century for China to lead the world. Correct. And when you're leading the world, we, the Nigerians, want to be close behind you. And when you're going to the moon, we don't want to be left behind. So the Nigerians want to be close to China because they see that China is a global leader. The Chinese foreign minister in 2018 in Senegal said that China will uphold its African policy and concept of sincerity, concrete results, affinity, good faith, justice, pursue shared interests, a shared future. So China is saying really that we are working very cooperatively and in good faith. And finally, President Xi in 2018, we'll come back to the business forum and so on, but China and African countries are destined to be good friends, good brothers, and good partners. And the China-Africa cooperation is about South-South cooperation. Now, the developing world, the global South, is emerging as emerging economies, and increasingly in their development, they see the cooperation between themselves, between the countries of the global South, rather than between the global North, i.e. the West, and the South. So the axis of cooperation is gradually changing, and China wants to be in there supporting its, because sometimes it sees itself as the developing country. So different perspectives. So just a little bit of background. I've explained a little bit about Taiwan as the Republic of China, but 1999 was the key time when China really changed, a sort of watershed moment, and became the People's Republic. And it was led, as you know, I'm sure, by Mao Zedong. And during the time of Mao's lifetime, the Mao era, China was very self-sufficient. It was very low global profile, very insular. Didn't really have very much to do with the outside world. You could see there some examples with Egypt and Zambia, but really not very much activity. But then in 1976, Mao died, and shortly after that, the Politburo realized that China didn't have very much money left in the kitty, and it was pretty much heading for bankruptcy. So in 1986, Deng Xiaoping, big name, really important to remember this president, President Deng. In China, remember, the Christian name is second, and the surname is Mr. Deng. Deng Xiaoping established this open door policy, and the key thing for that was economic growth at all costs. Whatever happens, whatever China does, we need economic growth within this socialist market economy. And that became a bit of a mantra throughout the development of China from 1986 onwards. And by the time we got to 1999, the policy was being extended to really look outwards onto the rest of the world. Chinese firms had become more efficient, they'd modernized for a number of reasons, which we'll come to, and it was a question of going out and investing in other parts of the world. So if you do a bit of digging, you'll find that the Chinese firms have often invested in assets in the UK and America and Europe. There's a lot of Chinese interest around the world, buying shares in various companies and so on. And that was the going out policy. And it was all about beginning to establish China on the global stage. And then in 2000, very important also, last thing about the background is that there was the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. And China, since then, has been nurturing relationships with its African neighbours. And the West is a bit suspicious of that, I think, too. So while all this, after a bit of history, while all this has been going on, China has been had a few concerns. It's running out of oil. It needs resources. It needs fuel. It needs various sources of power. It needs resources to grow its manufacturing. It's a big population. It's now realizing that it can't be sustainable, and so it's got to interact with the rest of the world. In the 1990s, poverty reduction became an issue, and it's a remarkable fact that 800 million people in China have been lifted out of poverty because of this economic growth at all costs, which have enabled people to have higher standard of living. It's an incredible success story by China, but it's been a real national concern. It hasn't been eliminated, but they've made huge strides. And then, as with this economic growth at all costs and this going out, China has got a lot of earnings. It's got a lot of money in foreign currency. And if you're doing economics, you know that if you have a lot of money, you can't put it under the bed. You need to find somewhere to put it and to make it work for you. So China is looking for somewhere to invest in foreign currency. And then finally, China as a global power. And we're not going to go into China versus the US, but I'm sure you're aware of antagonism, put it that way, of China and the US. So why is China interested particularly in Africa? That's what we're talking about today. And you can see there all the resources which Africa have, 90% of platinum and cobalt, you can see there the list, 75% of coltan, very significant, because coltan is in everything, our mobile phone, all kinds of electronics, and the West wants it as well as China, of course. That's a bit of a key. It's a key mineral. So it wants a guarantee of raw materials, and it wants agricultural products, of course. But at the same time, China has been modernizing. It's developing its manufacturing. It wants to sell stuff, so it's looking to Africa as a market for Chinese goods. China is aware that Africa has deals with the US and with the EU. So the US has a Let me just see remind me what it is. It is the for Europe, it's everything but arms agreement, and for the US, I'll have to come back and remind myself of what that was. But there are particular arrangements between the US and EU. So if China is producing resources in Africa, they can then make use of that tariff-free zone and export, via another route. Then there's the issue of migration. And it's the African Growth and Opportunity Act. That's what it is for America. Migration. Now, if you've all heard of the Three Gorges Dam, and clearly there were displacement of people, many thousands of people from the Three Gorges. So there are people who have been displaced from big Chinese projects. There are people in China who are looking for a better life and perhaps a bit more freedom. There are rising costs for businesses in China. There's industrial overcapacity, so it's quite hard to sell goods sometimes within China. And so there is some motivation for people to leave China, out-migrate from China, and settle in African countries on the back of big African companies, big Chinese companies trading, and state-owned enterprises. So out-migration is inevitably increasing on the back of the going out policy. And then the last three comments there are just talking about the African countries giving diplomatic support for China. I've mentioned Taiwan, in the big international institutions, including the World Trade Organization, the IMF, the World Bank, and so on. And critically, China has a different way of looking and investing in countries compared with the West. It's got an alternative development model. When the West has been entering into deals to support development in African countries, it's come with conditions in terms of a lack of reducing corruption and transparency and accountability. And China doesn't really want to interfere in national politics. So this alternative model of non-interference from China is really quite attractive to African nations. And potentially it marks out China as a superpower because it's got influence in so many of these 52 African countries. So trade and investment is what the lecture's about. Trading with the dragon, I've called it. Huge increases, as we know, over the last 20 years. And the balance is very much in China's favour. And what's important is that the increases have been huge. 20% per year has been remarkable. The Western countries would give their eye teeth to have that level of increased investment. And foreign direct investment also is from Chinese government is also growing apace. So you can see on this graph here the relationship between the imports and the exports. So China exporting to Africa in red is growing steadily, but also China importing from Africa. And some detail there, the imports from Africa up in a year, up by 31%, Chinese importing resources and materials from Africa. And that's a sense reflects how much Chinese manufacturing is developing, which is good news for Africa. And Chinese exports to Africa are up by 11%. So it is the highest growth rate of trade in the world. And the sort of trade varies, as I suppose you would expect. So the top graph there, the exports from Saharan African countries are predominantly fuel, predominantly oil, but a lot of minerals and metals, as we've been saying, to support Chinese manufacturing. But the exports from China to sub-Saharan Africa tend to be manufactured goods and machinery. And this is quite inevitable, I suppose. If you take the machinery, if you are in Nigeria, for instance, how do you develop your manufacturing industry if you don't have the machinery to do it? So essentially, China is in there at the very beginning, providing the mechanism by which Chinese firms and African manufacturing can get established, and Chinese firms are on the back of that. And manufactured goods, very significant. And gradually, and we hear a lot about Africans in poverty, but the reality is that many Africans are moving out of poverty into middle class status, and there are several emerging economies. So they're in low income emerging countries, and so that growing middle class actually demands manufactured goods, and if they're not made in a home country, Africa is there to provide them, and I'll show you some examples later on. So in terms of the trade, there's some details about the oil and gas. CNPC is the China National Petroleum Corporation. CNOOC is the Chinese National Offshore Oil Corporation, and then the Sinopec, which is another oil company, and they're state-owned enterprises. They're businesses which are owned and run by the state. And there's two elements to that with China and oil. Some of the deals ensure that the resources go directly to China, and some of them are actually on the global market. But and that's good for everybody, I think. So it's guaranteed trading. But also connected with oil and gas, one thing that China has been doing is not just getting the oil out of the ground and getting it to the port and exporting it, but it's actually part of the deal has been, you sell us your oil and we will help you develop all the other stages of oil manufacture and oil refining. So you probably know that from oil refining you get all kinds of multitude of things, pharmaceuticals, all kinds of plastics and so on, and at different stages of the refining process. And example there in Sudan now has a fairly well established oil refining processing, and that enables Sudan to make all sorts of other things. Minerals there, we talked about exporting uranium, coltan and so on. Agriculture, China needs food, it wants sugar, it wants cotton, and what's happened there is that Chinese companies have moved into Africa and established very large-scale agricultural companies, really, sort of industrial agriculture, by working with joint ventures. That's what JV stands for, joint ventures. So Chinese firms will come in and they will link up with local firms and cooperatives and begin to work on a large scale. There's an example there of Sakalis in Mali, a joint venture, 10,000 jobs, because of the investment from the Chinese companies into what was already existing in Africa, making it more efficient, moving to in industrial farming and all that agricultural technology and all the training which China can bring into Mali and Kenya and Ghana and so on. So there's been a benefit there. You're becoming more efficient in producing agriculture and you're training your local farmers. And then another type of trade is manufacturing. And essentially that is technology transfer. Now, when Deng Xiaoping established his open door policy, what it really meant was that he invited Western firms to go and work in China with Chinese firms, joint ventures in China, and benefit from the technology transfer that way. So the West had their technology, they wanted to have an inroad into China, they do a deal, they work jointly, and Chinese workforce are trained, and you can have some technology transfer. Over the years, and that was sort of 1986 onwards, so 20 years on, China is doing the same in Africa. So China is taking its firms and it's assembling vehicles, components, you can see there, home appliances, textiles, pharmaceuticals, developing manufacturing in China and in African cities in particular, and sharing the technology. But it's a win-win really, because China is also selling their own goods. So it's just what China was doing earlier with regard to the West. And actually, as the African middle class is growing, so there's a market particularly for home appliances. Now, my students, when I was teaching this at university, they always like to smile. And so I was giving me this, I hope you're looking at this now and you're smiling, because this is the kind of curiosity stuff. Someone said, you've got to have something quirky in a lecture. And did you know then that in 2018, I don't know the answer to this, why Benin, I've missed an N out of there, imported $411 million worth of wigs, or why South Africa imported so many underpants. I have absolutely no idea. Or why Mauritius exported so much soy sauce. Perhaps that's the illegal trade. Kenya exported the Chinese exported into Kenya plastic toilet seats. Extraordinary, really. But again, the quirky things. And Nigerians are obviously brushing their teeth more often. So that's something just to make you smile. You can go away and think about why that actually might be the case. So who is China trading with? Well, on the right-hand side, the exports into Africa, and you've got there South Africa, Nigeria, Egypt, the big guns. 4% of Kenya's exports, of all exports to China, come from Kenya. That's the interpretation. And then the imports to China from African countries mainly come from South Africa and Angola, but a significant proportion from other countries. And that was only 2012. So things are moving all the time. I should say, we talk about trade, and you talk particularly about Chinese trade. Sometimes you have to take the figures with a bit of a pinch of salt, and I've often found you get, different organizations will quote different figures because it's really quite hard to get absolutely hard and fast accurate data, but the ballpark figures are pretty much there. The key thing here, I think, is that far fewer exports by volume go to China than come from China. But as well as trade, you have investment, and the two things really go very closely together, because to support the trade, Chinese firms and government also invest in many different sectors in African countries to make the trade happen, to oil the wheels of trade, if you like. And you can see there on figure 2 where the countries are. Nigeria, Angola, Ethiopia, and so on. The countries that they're going to come up again and again as we go through this. And the sectoral distribution on figure 3 there, this is from Brookings. You can follow the reference at the bottom there. The sectoral distribution there, a lot is about transport, energy, metals, and real estate. Perhaps that's a surprise, but Chinese firms are buying up land and buildings, places in cities, places in rural areas for agriculture, for industrial agriculture, for export, free trade zones, a number of different industrial areas spread about the countries. So the question is this: self-interest to support other Chinese firms who are investing in and trading in African countries. Clearly, these investments are encouraged by African governments because the African governments haven't got very much money, and they do have to pay a lot back in debt to IMF and so on. But is this good for Africa? Is the amount of investment, which often comes with strings, from China into, is that now tying the hands of Africans? Is it benefit today and long-term accountability down the road? So a question. I haven't got the answer. Perhaps time will tell. This slide will show you some specifics about the foreign direct investment in Africa and the sorts of projects that there are. I mean, it's just a snapshot, really, but you can see a lot of it is transport and a lot of it is railways. And what's that about? It's about getting resources from obviously the central countries to the port. But if you build a railway for minerals, clearly you can get other traffic on the railway line as well. So it's all about moving resources from the centre of the countries to the port and developing the port sectors. African countries can't afford to build their own railways, so China is prepared to do that for them. There's also power, and despite the that China is the dirtiest country in the world, all these dirty power stations, China is going to be going, I think it's by 2045, it said that China was going to have complete green energy in China. And it is really trying to have a sustainable energy policy and going down the HEP route, solar route, and and wind power. It's trying to develop sustainable energy manufacturing and become a world leader in sustainable energy manufacturing, in fact. And then, perhaps unsurprisingly, when you think about it, there's cement. Now, you can't develop a city or roads or railways or manufacturing without cement. You need a cement factory, and China is providing the foreign direct investment to build the cement factory, and then it goes on to actually using that for other uses. So I can see the logic of that FDI. And this one will show you the number of businesses who are investing. You can look at the left-hand side situation in 2015 at your leisure, but you can see that the colours the choropleth will give you some indication. Nigeria is, and South Africa, Zambia, big investment there. And the expanding Chinese influence in countries and the volumes of trade and investment you can see there on the right-hand side. That's just the big industries, that's the state-owned industries. But when you look at it, there are thousands and thousands of small Chinese informal firms moving into Africa and building and establishing services towards all these others which are developing. And by 2019, 10,000 Chinese businesses of all kinds. It is a round number, and it's expanding really quickly. So that's the type of trading, both from China and from Africa and to Africa, and the sorts of things. But who is actually doing this in trading and investing? And I've commented a couple of times about the state-owned enterprises and multinationals. Well, basically, China likes to have its own industries. In People's Republic of China, it owned everything. And there's been really big state-owned enterprises, which during Mao's time were pretty inefficient, really, and they were propped up by the state banks, and they weren't particularly competitive. But because of the open door policy, with the help of multinationals, they become much more aggressive and efficient and modern, and they are now investing in Africa. And there's lots of joint ventures. Many of these Chinese companies, though, are owned by provincial governments. Now, you've got to think in China of the provinces as really quite independent, and they all want to develop themselves. Then sometimes they're really actually in competition with each other. So these provincial governments will have a car firm, or an iron and steel firm, or a pharmaceutical company, and they can't really encroach into each other. So they're looking for ways of earning money, because the provinces need to earn money to pay for health and education and raising poverty in their province. And so these different firms with the same manufacturing, cars, whatever, but lots of different firms in the provinces are looking to Africa to try and develop their business. So there's the big firms, and then there's thousands of small firms, the small entrepreneurs, often they're family owned, and they're the ones that are having quite an impact at a local scale in the local markets in Nairobi and Mombasa and Accra and so on. And increasingly there is migration from China into Africa, and also I put on the bottom there criminal gangs, of course, and no country is without its criminal gangs who are going into Africa. Now this slide is for you to really to take away, and you could perhaps do a little bit of work on this. And who are the actual firms? This gives a little bit of a portrait of the different types of firms who are in working in Africa. And I just draw your attention to one or two. Top left there, First Automotive Works, and they're making trucks. Of course, you need trucks if you are wanting to establish manufacturing in Ghana or Nigeria. The top right, small-scale clothing factories. Now, this is an interesting one. Is this good? Is it good that small clothing factories owned by Chinese are actually now competing with African firms? You need to think about that. Further down, as you go, you'll see the Sani Group in Kenya, machinery to establish industry. That's perhaps good news. At the very bottom, and quite a notorious, perhaps you could describe it, the China Non-Ferrous Metals Group. Now, they established in Zambia the Chambezi copper mine. And they had a very bad press, and I'm coming to an example of that later on. They were really bad news, and the Zambians and the Zambian workers, were working in very, very poor conditions, and a lot of complaints about the activity of that particular group. So is that good? It kept the mine open, but actually it came at a price for the workforce. And then bottom right there, you've got Mr. Wang. He's a farmer and grocer, and he's producing Chinese vegetables and fruit and so on for the Chinese market. So he's providing for the Chinese who are now working in Kenya and supplying Chinese supermarkets. So it's not a question of Chinese immigrants coming in to establish in say in Nairobi and merging with Kenyans, integrating. Quite a lot of it is quite separate, and small scale entrepreneurs like Mr. Wang are seeing an opportunity to provide for their own, not unlike small businesses in Chinatown in Liverpool, in Manchester, in London. We see them all over the world. That's not unusual. They're very different types of businesses. But just a word about the large firms and the way they think, really, because the features of the state-owned enterprises are that they do have a political advantage. They have the backup of the state. They're owned by the state. So effectively, they can undercut, they can work with any state. They can undercut any bids which other companies around the world are making for particular work. They can actually provide their own skilled managerial labour and not the Kenyan labour. So they have an advantage. They also, when Chinese state-owned enterprises come and say it sets pharmaceuticals in Nairobi, a small firm, and the Nigerians are interested in this firm. They would build the factory, get it going, and then there will be a deal with China to guarantee exports from that firm. It's called early harvest. So the first things which are being made from those manufacturing plants, there is a market for them in China. So, and that is a way of ensuring that you can develop manufacturing and you can sell what you're making. There's a guaranteed deal there. There's also reduced tariffs on imports. So that encourages more of the trade from African firms run by the Chinese back to China. And we're going to come to talk about diplomacy because state-owned enterprises are absolutely tied up with development assistance and the diplomatic ties that the Chinese government wants to develop. So there's large state-owned enterprises, and then there's large private investors, and also can be supported by the state. And here's an example of a large-scale enterprise. It's owned by Guangdong New South Group. It's a private conglomerate. It's amazing. If you look at that picture in the centre, you can see the Chinese name for it over the top of the big gantry there, the entrance to the free trade zone. And it's extraordinary. It's built in 7 years. One thing that China is really famous for is getting things done quickly. And you can see there just a tiny list of some of the things that are made in the free trade zone. And I've just put that selection in because why would you have tomato sauce? I've absolutely no idea why you have tomato sauce, but it's there. And you can go onto the Ogun Free Trade Zone and do some research if you wish. But the plans are ambitious. 8 sectors, 10,000 companies, really to generate huge industrial hub. Just not too far outside Lagos, with, of course, the connecting transport links into the city and to the port. But what about the private and the small-scale entrepreneurs? Well, you can see the characteristics there. They're very flexible. They respond to opportunities. They're pretty profitable. There's lots of them. all sizes, all sectors. They're very quick to get established, and they work really hard. They see an opportunity and they kind of go for it. And the big things about it, all entrepreneurial activity comes positive or negative. So for what are the positive things for African urban areas? We talked about technology transfer. They provide jobs, so it's good. And if people are moving, we've all looked at rural to urban migration. People do want jobs. There's a growing African population. They're beginning to develop their education, and they're going to get local jobs. And the Chinese are providing that opportunity and developing the skills. Good news. There aren't many consumer goods which are African made, and the Chinese firms are making refrigerators and air conditioners. That's great for this emerging middle class. And actually, the good news is they are encouraging African businesses as well to be more efficient. That's really good news. And here is some photographs I took when I was in Iringa in Tanzania. And a bicycle is really important. So these bicycles, rows and rows and rows of them outside a shop in Iringa, made in China. Why is this particularly good? Because as a mode of transport, you have got girls, this is a development issue, you've got girls in rural areas wanting to go to school. If they can go by bike, they're not going to be harassed, they can get there quickly, and it enables them to go on a more regular basis. So that form of transport on rough roads has been a real game changer for many African girls. And it's been affordable because they've been made in China by Chinese firms. The solar power. You look at rural areas. How do they get their light to study and so on? Through solar power units on the roof. You can see there the different sizes that are made by Chinese firms. Really good news. I was visiting a very small community, and the women had a sunflower oil processing plant, and this is the machine that made the sunflower oil microfinance that they were then selling. Guess what? The machinery was made in China. It's made so it's affordable, and these small scale microfinance industries can get established, and that's got to be good news. You may well have heard of M-Pesa, which is a terrific right across Africa money transfer payment system, and that's a Kenyan firm. But it's actually Safaricom, but the technology behind making that happen comes from Huawei. So the Chinese were there enabling that level of development and advancement to happen. It's been a game changer for many rural communities. It's not all good. So what about some private entrepreneurs without labour relations? They're factory floor jobs, not managers. They undercut local manufacturing. They may be copycat fabrics, and there's the Kente fabric. And they're putting local businesses at risk. And again, things that might make you smile. I read that the Chinese sex workers in the Cameroon were undercutting the Cameroonian sex workers. You can think about why that's the case another day. Chunky chickens, there's a reference at the end to a video with Justin Howlett called The Chinese Are Coming in Africa. And he was in a Lusaka market, and the Chinese had chunky chickens in their market stall, and the Lusakan farmers had really rather scraggy looking chickens. Which ones would you buy? Which company is going to be the most successful? No surprises. So it's perhaps making the Africans think more efficiently and differently about their businesses. But at the end, China exports the capitalism it knows, and that comes with attitudes as well. There are some negative things. Limited to final assembly, not actually production. Skill levels are not always what the Chinese demands. Bureaucracy is another issue. Illegal exports are an issue you can see there, poaching and so on. And there's also the issue of environmental degradation. There are social issues with Chinese migrants integrating into African societies. A lot of diverse groups. The The peasant farmers tend to integrate more because they're there for the long term. The elites and the managers tend to come 3-year, 5-year posting and then go back. But it's quite difficult to get the integration right. The Chinese have a reputation for hard work, and the Africans and then the British as well, much less so. So there's a lot of xenophobia and racism against the Chinese, and as I say, there's a lot of environmental degradation and the criminal activities. Here's an example of Zambia, where we've got good things. It's a joint venture with a cotton ginnery. In Zambia, the Chinese have built their health clinics and community programs, but there's still the issue of low pay and the decline of local businesses. And I was referring to Chambishi and the China Non-Ferrous Group, and here you are, low wages, poor safety controls, explosions, really bad news. And a lot of local, it was a vote winner for Michael Sarter, who was the opposition leader. He was objecting to the Chinese invasion, as he so called it. He became president in 2013, and actually then he actually reneged on his promise to reopen ties with Taiwan. Back to the politics and the diplomacy again. So let's just move on very quickly, because I'm looking at the time and thinking about diplomacy. It is as important as trade. China has geostrategic aims to be a global power. It wants to lead the Western, the less developed nations. It wants to keep Taiwan out of the UN. It has a policy of flex hegemony. Now, hegemony, the US is the leader. You lead, and the US calls the tune, and they do it their way. China has a flexible approach and will deal with countries where they are and with their existing structures and institutions. So it works in different ways with different states, as long as they actually do the trade. And it says it has 4 no's: no hegemony, no power politics, no military alliances, no arms race. They just want the market access and resources, and they want to have good relations with a range of African states. The most effective way of doing this is through this forum on China-Africa cooperation. You can see what it allows Africa to upgrade industrial technology, improve lives, promote economic development. It's good, it's win-win. And the African leaders have loved FOCAC. They've loved going to the red carpet treatment in Beijing and all these high-level visits, and it gives them a lot of street cred and a lot of status. But the critics will say, well, FOCAC is allowing anti-colonial sentiment to actually be nurtured. The foreign assistance there, essentially, it's country. China has got a lot of aid, but not very much of it goes bilaterally. It goes into the multilateral, the UN and so on. Most is bilateral. And it comes through these development banks. You can see them on the screen there. Basically, the Chinese government puts money into these investment banks, and they then can, go and develop and support new businesses with loans and contracts. There are claims that the firms which are supported are ignoring environmental impact, they're ignoring social standards, and these firms could invest at a loss. And China doesn't worry if they operate at a loss, as long as they are actually in Ghana, Angola, Mozambique, wherever. So within all of this, there's a lot of contradictions in Chinese trade and investment. It's all tied up with political expediency and diplomacy. But the bottom line here is important. For China, it's economic growth at all costs. That's what China wants, needs, and is going to continue needing. And here's some examples of what perhaps some people would call vanity projects, prestige projects, which the Chinese Party, the Chinese Communist Party, the government have funded to get African leaders on side. And they absolutely love having these wonderful conference centres and railways and theatres and so on. So perhaps you need to consider whether the huge investment in these big projects is appropriate, or whether there should have been investment into more local, small-scale projects which are going to develop poorer Africans and rural Africans, because all these are in cities. Some examples here about the diplomacy and the infrastructure there. I'm not going to go through them. You can look at that when you go through this afterwards. But I would just draw your attention to the bottom, corporate social responsibility. I mean, we have that here, CSR policies. And, firms, Sainsbury's, Aldi, whoever, they all have their social responsibility and they do their community stuff. And Chinese firms are just the same. I look at this and why have the Chinese non-ferrous metal mining invested in health, polio, HIV, malaria prevention? And in a sense, it's to get the local communities on side. So they could be seen as a threat initially, but the Chinese firms are increasingly realize that if they do something for their local people, then it can be win-win. And the social element of supporting local village infrastructure is as important as the trade. Here's an example of the Bui Dam in Ghana, which this is an opportunity. This is an example where China jumped in where we refused as the West, because Ghana asked the World Bank for money to develop the Bui Dam. It's in the west of Ghana there. And the World Bank refused. So China jumps in. The deal was, we will invest in the Bui Dam if you will guarantee to give us 40,000 tons of cocoa per year. China love their chocolate. And so in come the Chinese contractors. They can develop companies now building on the power, which has been produced by Bui, and so everybody benefits. This is all part of the kind of going out, combining with economic and foreign policy objectives. But critically, it's China and the development banks seeing an opportunity which we didn't take, and now they're building on that and reinforcing their presence in Ghana. China has money, China, like any other global power, has aid, and here you can see the different types of aid which China is giving to Africa. The foreign aid budget has increased over the years. You can see the graph there. So it's becoming a player in terms of expenditure. Good news, but actually, it works differently to the Western aid because it's fairly free flowing. And initially, China gave aid to countries with no strings. And you see the second bullet point there, unsustainable debt trap. So the question now is, has China lent too much money to some African nations, and they are so indebted to China that they are now beginning to face really quite severe problems in paying back that debt. And now China's thinking, a few more controls on lending to some of these African states, because it's not as secure, and the debt repayment is not as forthcoming, as becoming a liability compared with what it used to be. Unpaid loans, rumored. And here you can see how much overseas debt is owed to China. Angola, huge amount, 16.5 billion pounds owed to China. And it's a small country with oil, not very much more. And at the bottom table then, the stalled, failed, cancelled deals. Within all of this, there's hard and soft power. I'm not going to develop on this because I know I'm running out of time, but I just want to say that inexplicably, trade and investment is linked to influence, whether that's hard diplomacy, hard power in terms of literally arms and political ties, or whether it's soft power. And I've given an example there of a Chinese film. You can go and probably get Wolf Warrior on Netflix. So, where does this lead China's influence in Africa? So what do the Africans think? They love being treated as equals. They love the non-interference. There's a big free trade area, and it's just being established. And the manufacturing which is being developed in Africa, people are trading between the African countries, and that's got to be good news. The projects are completed quickly. Just don't even think about our high-speed rail. It's taking years and years and years. There's also the China Belt and Road Initiative. It's a big initiative from China, and this is the map. the road is actually the maritime road. It's shipping links building into Dar es Salaam, Mombasa, and actually Djibouti. And there's also the land link. African cities, African ports are on the Silk Road. And so China is buying into that. And you can see there that the civil society is a bit fed up with the Europeans and the West, because we've put trade conditionalities on, our aid is declining, they're saying that we have double standards, it's unpredictable. And actually the African elites love all the capital investment that China is making. So you can see there that the darker blue are the people who are really very supportive of China and Africa. But I just ask you this question: does Africa need businesses which sell local things in the local market, like chickens and eggs? So to conclude, China does need resources. It can get them in Africa. China is open for Chinese goods. Africa is open for Chinese goods and trade and investment. The African nations want to develop. China wants to exercise some global leadership. But the key thing is, can these two sides work together? And there's a sense that some African countries are working differently with China, and China is perhaps buying off one country against another. And perhaps the most effective way of China-Africa relations developing is that they all work together, which is really what's beginning to happen from the 1st of July this year in a free trade area. So essentially, my conclusion is kind of trade with care if you are in Africa. Some questions for you. Should Africa beware of China? Is China a benevolent force? Do you think China is acting in a neo-colonial way? And how should we respond? How should the West respond to this China invasion in Africa? And I have put some reading at the very end. There's the video. It is on YouTube. And Dead Aid, Why China's Not Working. And there's a couple of others that you can look at. So that's it. And I'm happy to take questions at the end. Let's just go back to one. But I need to get my other screen. Forgive me while I get my other screen, because it has gone dead on me. So I need to just re-engage and see what the comments are. So Isabel, keep talking to me while I get my other screen up.
Oh, so that was absolutely fascinating. It was lovely to hear all of the different ways in which China and Africa are interacting and what effects that's having locally. We do have one question's come in so far from Kate Stockings, who says, is it right that many African governments are starting to question China's investment? And I know that's something you did touch on briefly at the end there.
I think it is right, because they're worried about how permanent the investment will be, and what were the strings attached to that investment, or whether that investment really has meant benefit for Africa, or whether it is that, particularly in terms of mineral exploitation, all the minerals are going to China. And are the Africans now missing a trick because they want their own mineral exploitation industries and firms? It's exactly the same with the Australians. There's been a huge, rather an outcry from Australians who want to stop China exporting too much iron ore from Pilbara, for instance, because they want it for themselves. And African countries, quite rightly, they see coltan and they think this is a really important mineral in DRC, and DRC should be in control of this because it's so valuable. Why are we sending it all to China? On the other hand, if you sign the contract, then it's not very good if you renege on the contract. And in a sense, I think some nations feel that their hands are now tied, because unless they go along with Chinese investments, those investments will dry up, and they're pretty dependent on them. So it's key.
Right. Okay. We do have another question to come in from Geography in Your Jammers, who I remember from last week. Have there been any other countries following in the footsteps of China, perhaps investing into other LICs?
The quick answer is no, but you need to look at China investing in Latin America, particularly Brazil and Mexico. That's not the same question, I know, but China is also going there, very much for the same reasons. I mean, we have big transnational corporations. We have Rio Tinto Zinc, for instance, who are wanting to maintain their ties in Africa. But we don't have, there's no other country in the world that has, to be honest, has the financial resources. China is a really very wealthy country at state level, and it needs to spend its money. The US is really increasingly inward looking. And even if the US is dealing and wanting to invest in African countries, it comes with strings because there's much more demand for accountability from the US state. We do, British companies investing in Ghana or South Africa want to know that there is going to be transparency, that there's going to be good working standards, and the labor conditions are fair, etc. And that actually it comes with an expense, and it makes it more difficult for firms to invest in African countries because it's more expensive. So China is the only one really who is going at it, 120%, to be honest.
Right. Okay.
Thank you, Janice, for that question. I can see them on my screen now.
Yeah. Okay.
I must say, I'm sorry to have gone through it so quickly. I have a reputation for talking quickly and trying to cram too much in. So you need to go back tomorrow or another day and look at this more carefully and soak it up.
Well, yeah, I mean, it sounds like it's a very complex and intricate sort of matter to go into. So we're very grateful for you to have given us so much information in this time. And if there aren't any more questions coming through, I think probably that's a good place for us to stop for today.
I probably exhausted you. I'm really sorry. There you go.
I'm sure everyone's enjoyed it very much. So thank you very much for your presentation. It was lovely to have you with us this afternoon. We hope to see you again. And I'll take this moment just to remind everyone that, again, there are more lectures coming up with GEO over the next few weeks, going up to Christmas, that you can sign up to. Next week, we're talking to Joseph Kursky, who's coming all the way from America to speak to us. And he'll be talking about understanding change over space and time using WebGIS and spatial data, which sounds like it's going to be a really intriguing subject. Okay, well, with that, I'll wish you all goodbye from the GA, and thank you.
Bye for me, as they say on the television. Thank you very much, Isabel. Okay,
yes,
bye.
I hope to see you all again next week. Bye.